Hi, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12A lesson for today. Now, today we're going to go over the third lesson from Unit 1, which is about Gawain and the Green Knight. So I'm actually just going to jump right in because there's a lot of information to cover here. So this lesson starts off, I'm on slide number 5. It starts off with a timeline of the medieval period and information about different events that happened during that time. So I'm not going to read everything that's in here, but I'm just going to go over them very quickly and point out when they happened and why they were important. In general, all of these things affected how people wrote and what kind of stories people wanted, just in general. But basically, things that affect culture affect how writing works and what people write about and what things and why. So just going to go ahead and get started with the Western Roman Empire falling. So this happened in 476. We're covering a very wide range of time here. So if you recall from the very first lesson, they went over the history of the English language and they talked about how around the year 500 AD, the Romans who had occupied Britain basically got called off to defend other areas that they controlled and left Britain weak. So this is basically that. So it says here they were fighting against external pressures like the Huns from Central Asia and Germanic tribes of Europe from the north. And at this time, the last emperor was overthrown by a barbarian leader. This is the event that basically left Britain open for the Vikings to move in. And that's how we got Old English or Anglo-Saxon. This is right before the period of Beowulf. Now the next section is the Prophet Muhammad dies. So basically the year 632 is where we have records of him, of his death. And this happened in Saudi Arabia. Now, there were relationships between the East and West, the West being Europe and the East being the border of Europe and the Middle East. So this is significant because it affects how those countries interacted with each other at the time. And it also affects a couple things that happen a little later in terms of the exchanging of rulers. Jerusalem changes hands, people conquer it and reconquer it back and forth. So this is just important to note. The next event is in 793. This is when the Vikings raid the Lindisfarne Monastery. Now, remember when I said that the Western Empire falling left things open to the Vikings? That is exactly what happened. The Vikings ended up settling in the area, and they were run off by the Anglo-Saxons just a little later. So they let you know the Vikings are known as Danes, and they settled into areas that they raided in the existing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So they almost destroyed those pretty much. And this specific monastery was a big historical event. They talked a lot about, like, there are records of all of the religious readings and texts that were burned at this time. The next event is actually 800, which is the coronation of Charlemagne. So Charlemagne was he was basically crowned by the Pope, and he was a Holy Roman Emperor. So he was basically the head of the East Roman Empire, and he united the East and Western empires. So the important thing about this here is that this was the start of the church having such a big influence over the rest of the world, especially with Catholicism becoming involved with the crown. So this is the start of the church having a lot of political and even some military power backed by whoever was in charge at the time. This is very important because the church ends up building itself up to have unreasonable amounts of power, enough to affect the everyday lives of folks later on. So this is pretty much where it started. The church and the crown pretty much had such a tight bond that later on, when kings started defying what the church wanted them to do and doing things against the advice of the current pope, the church was able to get its own power together to try to oppose what kings were doing at that time. And if you are dealing with any type of power that can oppose a king, that's how you know that the power balance is kind of out of control. Now, the next event is in 1066, which is the Battle of Hastings. If 1066 looks familiar to you, it's probably because in the history of the English language, there was a section specifically about this battle. This is also the start of what's considered the age of Middle English. So the long story short is that the Anglo-Saxons were able to take over most of Europe, but not the eastern side of, I'm sorry, the Britain. They were able to take over most of Britain, but not the eastern side of Britain. So Edward the Confessor, who was ruling the small section of Britain on the East Coast at that time, he basically, once the Anglo-Saxons were weakening their hold on the region and dealing with other stuff, he made a pact with William of Normandy to give him land to be king of if he helped. Now, Normandy is just the old version of France. They used to be called Normandy and the people were called the Normans. So he basically cut a deal with a king from another country that if they got help from them, they would be made king of some parts of England after they won their land back from the Anglo-Saxons. Now, unfortunately, Edward died before he could fulfill this. And pretty much what happened was that the French king was like, okay, well, I'll talk to the new king and get, the land that I'm supposed to get. And have the influence I'm supposed to have. But the guy that Edward named as his successor to take the throne afterwards, his name was Harold Godwinson. And he basically refused. He was like, yeah, well, that deal was with that other guy who's dead and not me. So what I'm not going to do is give you land to be king of, because I literally just got the throne. So the French, or the Normans, were pretty mad about it and decided that they were going to go to war about it. So they did that, and they defeated Harold and basically took over a large part of Britain. And that's why we have so much French in our language. Okay, the First Crusade. So again, not going to read through this entire section. I'm going to leave that to you guys. But the long and short of the First Crusade is that the eastern section of the Roman Empire, even though they were united, basically was known as the Byzantine Empire, pretty much. And that section of the Roman Empire was dealing with Turkish people and other powers in the Middle East trying to take back control of Jerusalem, which they had control over at the time. And the long story short of it is that they called upon different nations and other powers from the continent that they could have, that they had alliances with, and said, hey, send some soldiers to help us keep Jerusalem. So the First Crusade was pretty much those people and their journey from their countries on the west coast of Europe to Jerusalem to try to defend it. That's pretty much what the First Crusade was. There's a lot more detail to it than this. And some of it's listed here, and some of it is too complicated to put all in one lesson. You could do a whole lesson on the First Crusade, actually. But that's what's most important. They were going to Jerusalem to fight the Muslims who were trying to take it over, because they viewed Jerusalem as part of their Holy Land. and they wanted it back. That land had been exchanging hands since forever, pretty much back and forth. So a lot of those people were French and British that actually went across the rest of the continent to try to get there and help. The next event here is the 100 Years' War. Now, the 100 Years' War did last a little more than 100 years, from 1337 to 1453, as we have here. Now, this was a war that was fought between the French and the British. And the most famous thing that I think most people remember about this war, even if they don't know anything about it, is the story of Joan of Arc came from this war. So if you've ever heard the short story about Joan of Arc being a martyr, being named as a saint because she believed that God gave her a vision to help end the war. She did actually help end one of the sieges, but not the entire war. So she pretty much is the most famous thing about this. But the 100-Year War affected language and cultural stuff, which kind of rolls into what we're going to learn about today. And around the last two events here, so in 1347, the plague. So if you're asking, hey, did this happen during the 100 Years' War? Absolutely. So the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, started in the mid 1300s. And obviously, it was a very big pandemic that happened. But to try to put it into perspective, it killed almost half of the population in only a few years. So you're going to find a lot of references to the plague in writings from this time. A lot of religious texts, rituals, things like that were about trying to keep the plague away. And let's see, last but not least, the peasants' revolt. So we're going to learn a little more about why the peasants were revolting in this lesson. But basically, peasants were the bottom tier of the social ladder. And because it was an unequal system and things were unfair, a guy named Wat Tyler got the peasants together and tried to start a revolt with people from Kent and Essex, which are sections of Britain. They basically managed to get the king to promise to make things a little better for them, but the king pretty much reneged and didn't do any of the things he promised to do. And the mayor of London ended up killing Wat Tyler. So this was an unsuccessful revolt. And that's pretty much the timeline. These are just some of the events that influenced things that were written at this time. So it's just important to know the background. Now here, we're getting into the medieval period. We're going to get a summary of just the medieval period. So they start off just by letting you know that it's very different than the Britain from the Anglo-Saxon period. So the biggest things that made this different is that, one, most people were Christian. Before, people worshiped many gods. There was a lot of influence from the North, Scandinavian practices and religions. So not everybody practiced the same thing, but Christianity was being spread during that time. Remember, this is around the time where the Roman Empire fell. So this is not too long after Jesus died historically, and the Christian religion spread to most of Europe. So two, one of the biggest differences is that towns were in early stages of development. So before, during the Anglo-Saxon period, people basically had like huts and other structures that were just around the land that people owned. But in the medieval period, we did actually have towns. So they give you what the structure of a town was at this time. So the town had a few different parts. At the very, very top, the most important thing was a manor. So a manor was basically how it sounds, a big house that had lots of servants and things like that. And the manor was pretty much in the center or the back of the village, and the village was surrounding the manor. And that's where people lived, where shops were, and you could get services and things like that. And then on the outside of the village or villages, because sometimes there was more than one, you would have a land that was divided into meadow space, forest, pasture, and fields. So these are all just different types of land that were used for different things, for people to go out and make things, for people to grow things, all of that stuff. Now, they broke up the land into sections. So 1/3 of the land was reserved for nobility. So if you were royal or noble blood, then you stayed in a bigger house on that property and you were supposed to manage other sections of the property. A good portion went to the church. So the church had their own buildings. They were basically a private business by this point because they were so popular. So the church had their own buildings for church and mass gatherings. They had their own offices where they helped or worked together with the nobility to accomplish stuff. And basically, it was a hub for people who were part of the clergy or the church to do whatever it was that they were doing at the time. And the rest was divided up among vassals, which were people who were appointed by the lords, and then peasants and serfs. So they break this down a little later in the next slide, but the peasants and serfs basically were the people who worked the land. And in exchange for working the land, they got to stay on the property and keep some of what they planted sometimes. But they had to pay taxes in exchange for this too, because having a house, having land to work, they still considered it as you owing whoever owned the land. And the important thing about this system is basically called feudalism. And that's pretty much what it is. It's just local military and political relationships among those that are in power. So pretty much everyone at the top knew each other and they were working together to oppress the people who were making and growing things for them, pretty much. It was definitely an unequal system. You couldn't just earn your way up to the top. Usually if you were born a serf or a peasant, you would always be one. And it was super rare for people to like marry down or marry someone who was of lower stature. The idea was to try to find someone who was close, maybe a little higher than you on the scale, but not too high, and that sort of thing. So on this slide, number 7, they break down feudalism a little more and give you the rankings of the system. So we start with the king at the very tippy top. So the king, it owns like the country, the region, but he also has lords. So those people who are like in his cabinet, who are very tight with him, he divides his land up amongst the lords. So the lords basically were people who like had the manors. So the central areas, so they control sections of the region or the country. So in return for having that kind of power, they pretty much supported the king and were obligated to collect tax payments for him, have men that they could send to him if he needed help with a military incursion, and political support. If the king was trying to pass a law or something like that, then they would have to rally the lords that were on their side and try to get them to support him. So after that, we have knights. So the feudal lords, like they had a lot of land to cover, sometimes more than one section of land. So they designated knights. And knights were usually people who were trained to do military combat and also be knowledgeable about other things. So the feudal lords broke up all of their land and gave them to the knights. And the knights are basically supposed to do the military service in exchange for this land. So that's how, so having a lot of knights meant that you had a lot of military power. And then once we get there, the knights are pretty much the highest nobles who are not directly connected to the king. So they broke up their parcels of land and handed them off to vassals. So vassals are considered lesser nobles, but they're still nobles. And below them, vassals had peasants who were just common people who ran the land. So pretty much if you weren't running a business, if you weren't a merchant, if you didn't make something useful with your hands, if you didn't have a business that was passed down in your family, some sort of technique to do or make or provide something so you could have your own business, you were a peasant. So peasants were just people who were poor in exchange for working the land that had been broken up 6 or 7 or 8 times. They got to stay there. They got a small, tiny portion of what they worked, but they also had to pay taxes. Serfs are even lower than that. So serfs are people who usually are in debt, people who don't have any family, they've been like abandoned, they don't have anyone to help support them. So if you were a serf, you were basically attached to the land. So you would cut a deal with the person who owns the land, and you were pretty much an indentured servant there, pretty much. You were considered the property of the lord that owned groups of property, pretty much. So you were considered like a thing that was bundled together with the sectioned off land. And even though quality of life had improved since the Anglo-Saxon period and there weren't just warring tribes and stuff like that, it was still pretty bad. It was very unequal. There was no way to move up really. And just people treated you like crap if you were part of the lower caste, even if you provided something. If you were a peasant, even if you were good at something, people didn't really pay you any attention. They pretty much treated you really rough. So here, they give you a chart of the social structure. This is located in the English concepts summary. So if you want access to this, feel free to ask your mentor or something like that. So they basically break it down into sections. So they group all of the nobility together here, which is easier instead of describing all the different titles. But barons, lords, and knights are all grouped together. They're all nobility. They're people who own land, they own people. And they were known just for being important enough to own land under the king. The lords are higher up than the knights, obviously, but there were uneven structures. There basically, if you liked someone a lot and you knew them, you could give them land if you needed someone to run it. So it was entirely based on who your favorites were and who you knew. There just wasn't really any way to change your designation other than knowing someone who liked you enough. And here they also talk about the clergy, which is the church. So they give you a little more detail about that. So it says, although the clergy took a vow of poverty, many members of the clergy lived a good life. Like the nobility, they often ran land and manors in exchange for loyalty to the king. Okay, so now we're finally getting around to things that are directly related to the reading, which is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And they talk about chivalry here, and they give you the definition of chivalry, which is the term for the knightly system of honor in the Middle Ages. The word has roots in French, Spanish, and Italian, and all of those words mean the same thing, which is a warrior who fights on horseback. So if you remember from the history of the English language lesson, we talked about cognates, which were words that look similar and sound the same when you are looking at them and when you see them written down. These are all those type of things. Pretty much, these words all mean the same thing, even though they are in different languages. But they tell you in the bottom paragraph, chivalry was more than just a code of knighthood. They were bound to a strict moral code of courtesy, generosity, valor, and skill in warfare. So you couldn't just be a knight just because you wanted some land or because you knew someone. Knights in particular had to actually have those other skills, and they had to follow the code of chivalry. So codes of chivalry also said that a knight should honor and serve ladies and maidens. So the knight's motto was loyalty to Lord, God, and lady. So this section here, slides 9 and 10 talk about the life of women in the Middle Ages. So basically, the summary is the life of women was very, very difficult. So women didn't really have rights at that time. They weren't considered people, and it was very rare, but they could inherit land. It was very rare, it didn't happen very often. And even if they had land, they usually weren't given enough sway or influence over anything. They didn't have any representation on the town council. And if you were married or not inheriting something from a relative, you needed consent from your husband to do things. Also awful is that they were considered instruments of evil at the time. They were considered an evil that people had to live with. And part of the reason why this was is because the widespreadness of Christianity led people to believe that Eve's temptation of Adam in like the, the mythology, the first story of the Bible, after God made the Garden of Eden, he put Adam and Eve, they were the first people there. And Eve was tempted by the snake and ended up betraying Adam and God. She got Adam to eat from the fruit of knowledge, which God told them not to do. So they were cast out. So because of this, Christians didn't think very highly of women, but they're needed for reproduction to produce heirs and stuff like that. So they just weren't treated that well. One of the ways that they were able to escape a life of discrimination and just difficulty was going to a nunnery. So a nunnery was a religious institution where women were to learn more about the Christian faith and devote their lives to God and being pure. And nunneries were the only place where women could actually learn to read and write. So a lot of them went just for those reasons. Later in the medieval period, they tell you here, ideas about women began to change because the birth of Christ offered, and the story of the birth of Christ offered another viewpoint of women. So Mary was chosen specifically by an angel and by God to give birth to Christ. And because of this, once it was added to the Bible and it was in circulation in print, people started to treat women differently and actually worship Mary and try to worship the traits that they felt was ideal for women to have. It says here, she represented everything nurturing, pure, and strong in women. She reached idol status and people worshiped her. So because of that, there was a shift in how people thought of women, and the concept of a lady gained prevalence. Now, when we call, women like, oh, act like a lady, we're calling back to this time period when they formed this idea of what a lady was. Okay. On this slide, I'm not going to play this, but this gives you the complete legend of King Arthur from the oldest version of the story. The thing is, there's a lot of different versions of King Arthur, but this gives you one of the earliest ones from start to finish, so that you're not confused about the different references that exist in Gawain and the Green Knight, because they do make references to some of King Arthur's legend details. And Sir Gawain was eventually written in as one of King Arthur's knights. So he's related as a character to the legend. Now here in this next section, we're going to learn about the medieval romance. So Gawain and the Green Knight is considered a romance story, but what is a romance? So when we hear romance, we think true love. We think, romance in the sense of being lovey-dovey and devoting yourself to your partner. But this isn't what it means when we talk about medieval romance. Originally, romance meant from Roman or in the Roman style. So when people in the Middle Ages talked about romances, they meant stories, because Romans often used stories to convey ideas about how people should be, the forces that are acting in the world, different morals, and things like that. In other lessons from English 11, I'm not sure if you remember, but there is a section about how the Greeks and Romans developed tragedy and theater during their reigns. And this is pretty much where romance comes from. It's referring to those stories which were trying to like impart wisdom and give people information. So when they talk about medieval romances, they mean medieval stories. Think about it the same way you would think about the word narrative. Um, and they give you some information in these bottom two paragraphs about love in comparison to the word romance. So very few people married for love, which I'm sure surprises no one considering how women were treated back then. But the point of getting married was for political or monetary gain. You basically wanted to marry someone who had connections for you and any children that you might produce, to be able to survive after you were gone, or so that you could have a good life. That was pretty much it. But the idea of courtly love basically came from people who started a relationship out of wedlock. So courtly love used to describe the relationship between a knight and another man's wife. Usually it was the lord or the baron that the knight was serving. And it was the first time, really, at least in terms of written stories, that people talked about pursuing someone because they were attractive or um, interesting in like a sexual sort of way instead of just for uh, politics. There were more emotions attached to the person that they were having an affair with. So people often use courtly love to talk about what they think is traditional types of love. And there are some elements in that during the Middle Ages, because the knights often were on trips or were off doing things for their lord. So a lot of courtly love stories show the knight secretly devoting themselves to this person that they're attracted to from afar, and letting the fact that the person exists and has feelings for them motivate them to do well on their quest so that they could come back. It was basically like a very, very, very old school long distance relationship, except it's secret. And also she's married to someone else. So good luck with that. So that's pretty much how that developed. When women stopped being considered as evil, um, they used to basically be considered worthy of worship, similar to the Virgin Mary. So these romance stories didn't really involve love the way that we think of it now. They were basically like really long, drawn out action adventure stories with like a sprinkle of those long pining R&B tracks that you hear on the radio about how you wish you could be with somebody. That's basically what they were. So here on this slide, they pretty much just give you a compare and contrast to Beowulf and the Middle Ages. So Beowulf talks a lot about fighting, how rough stuff is, staying out in the wilderness, having to fight all the time. Quality of life had improved a little bit, and more people had spare time. If you were a noblewoman who didn't have to work, like if you were married to someone who was rich or who had a lot of influence, you had people in your home that would do work for you. They would be doing work in exchange for a place to stay, or maybe their husband had land outside of the villages that they worked. And they got chosen to have that instead of just sort of like roaming on the streets. So people had actual free time. And that's pretty much how stories came to be during this period. Before, when there were tribes, people would get together at night before battles or before moving, and the entire village would get together, or the tribe would get together at like a bonfire, or in small groups and tell stories. But here, since people have more individual lives that are not just part of like the group, you end up with people who actually had free time if they had money, especially since women weren't allowed to be in control of anything. What could they do? So a lot of stories developed specifically to entertain people who had free time. Medieval romances, remember, meaning story, not actual love romance, basically filled in the demand for lighthearted entertainment, the same way that movies do now. People would just sit and read these stories because they had nothing better to do or they wanted to experience something outside of what was happening in their life. So romances originated in France, but it became very popular in England. So now we get into Gawain and the Green Knight. Now that you have all that information, we finally get there. So again, I'm not going to read the excerpt, but I will give you some of the background that they give you here. Some things they want you to keep in mind while you're reading this is that medieval romances would have been performed out loud in a similar way that epic poems are. And while you're reading, they want you to look for alliterative verse. So remember, alliteration is when words start with the same letter or the same consonant sound at the beginning of each word. They want you to pay attention to symbols or allusions. And that's kind of why they gave you all this information. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight mentions some of the things that have happened in history. It mentions some of the information about the life that these people lived that we just went over. And then they also want you to pay attention to the bob and wheel stanza pattern. If you don't remember that, don't feel bad. It wasn't addressed here, but they want you to pay attention to how the stanzas are structured. And they're going to go over information about how the stanzas are formatted when you actually go through the analysis here. Oh yeah, okay. So here they go over the opening. And they pretty much give you a good analysis of everything that's in here. The bob and weave wheel device helped to make Sir Gawain and the Green Knight popular. So they go over that information. You should have it. And this reading is pretty long. It takes a little bit of time to get through. But Middle English has been translated. The Middle English in this poem has been translated to Modern English. So you don't have to worry about trying to understand it. They put it in Modern English. So it's easier for you to grasp it from line to line. And also, because it's long, take your time. Again, I think this is the last section of the lesson. So if you are having issues with reading through the sections, please arrange a tutoring session with one of our English tutors to help you actually go through and pick out and understand what's in those excerpts. But most of that lesson was just about the history that was behind it. It's very important for you to understand how life was for those people because it was reflected in those types of stories. I've said this a million times, but I'll say it one more time. The reason why you feel like you're getting a history lesson when you are studying English is because you are. You have to understand the background behind why people write what they write and what influenced people to write whatever it is that they wrote at the time. That's super important. So you're going to keep getting history lessons and things while you're working through stuff. So just try to take notes on why things were important, take notes on when things happen, and you should be fine. Okay, this was a long one. Sorry, guys. But this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.